My baby dolls, how's things going? What's going on? Welcome to another episode of Genesis. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and the co-captain, the co-pilot, the man with the plan. He's last week he was Arizona. Now he's running around somewhere like a chicken without his head in his hometown of New York City. But we got a great show for you here today. We got a recurring guest in Leslie Heffy. She's coming back to talk about her wonderful book of the Encyclopedia of Women in Baseball. And all of us are going to get an education in women in baseball and their history today on Genesis. As always, you are listening to Genesis, which we are part of the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Ralph will kill me anyway. And with the Ralph Tycho, the Zigzag Man. And it's always an honor to be on his network. You can also find me talking with Alan Blumkin and Full-Time Baseball on their podcast as well. But, Leslie is returning to the show. And again, just to refresh your memory, we had Leslie. She wrote what I consider is the best starting point for the Negro Leagues. And we had her on about 3 weeks ago. And now we're going to have her on for women's baseball. And we're going to have her again on next month to finish up our discussion on the Negro leagues. But if you don't know who Leslie Heffy is, and I'll remind you all, Leslie Heffy was elected to the SABR Board of Directors in 2010. She has been a member of SABR since 1989 and chair of the Women in Baseball Committee since 1995. Leslie is an associate professor of history at Kent State University at Stock and publishes in the area of the Negro Leagues, like I mentioned, and women's baseball. In 2008, she became the founding editor of the journal Blackball, published by McFarland. She lives in Kent State, Ohio. She was the 2014 winner of the Bob Davis Award, SABR's highest honor. And what this doesn't tell you on is that she is also a member of the board of directors for the International Women's Baseball Center, which we'll all get into that during this discussion. Without any further ado, welcome to the show, Leslie. How have you been?
Thanks, Ian. I appreciate it. I'm doing well on this rather dreary day.
Yeah, it's dreary in the Northeast, too. You're out in Ohio. You're bringing me the bad weather because the jet stream flows west to east.
Yeah, we see it first.
Yeah. Have you been following the NCAA tournaments?
Oh, yeah. Well, Kent was in it at least the first round, so we had to, we lost to UCLA in the first round, and now we're waiting to see what happens with two teams that have never been in the Final Four before, with Gonzaga and South Carolina. So it's kind of cool.
Huge. They busted up my bracket, South Carolina.
I think they did everybody.
They busted up my bracket. I do have, Obama, former President Obama, picked North Carolina to win it all. They all laughed at him, but they're in the Final Four. I always had Gonzaga, for whatever bracket I've done, in the Final Four. Finally, they made it. And they'll be taking on South Carolina, and I think it's Oregon against North Carolina. And
correct. Yep.
We're going to have to wait till next weekend when all this madness ends. But we're not here for that. But we are here for your Encyclopedia of Women in Baseball. Let me ask you this. This was such a labor of love, and you had a lot of contributors. I know it says in the preface and all this, you didn't do this alone. Why do this Encyclopedia of Women in Baseball, and how long did it take to edit this and put it together?
Well, I had been thinking about it for a long time, and finally just decided that it needed to be done because in order to, I think, give any subject matter a starting point, you've got to have the basic information, and there just isn't that much written about women's baseball, and certainly not beyond just a few of the highlighted players. And so I decided that this needed to be done, and it would be a starting point, and that was always the intent, which is why we're working on a second edition right now. But the intent was to get it out there so that people could tell me who was missing. And people would call me and say, hey, how come I'm not in there? Or how come my sister isn't in, or my mother isn't in there? And that's what some people have certainly done, and we've been gathering lots and lots of information since that one came out. But that was the intent. And once I decided that we wanted to do this, it probably only took me, I think, about 2 years to put the whole thing together. Because I'd been gathering stuff for a long time, and it just suddenly said, okay, we just have to do this. And I decided that this would be a great opportunity to get some other people involved as well. So I asked some others to write in particular areas. Some of them are my students, which is always a great opportunity to get your students involved, and I'll get them some publications. And then others were people who have been doing research in women's baseball for quite a while.
And it's such an interesting story, and a lot of our folks at home don't realize the importance, not to mention the longevity of women in baseball history. Why don't we go back to like the 1870s, right after the Civil War? And let's talk about some of the colleges that decided to have women baseball teams.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing that right after the Civil War, everybody realizes that baseball expanded, and that's really the period, but it expanded in every venue. It wasn't just for white men or black men or anything. It was also for women. And where we found it for women is going to be at the women's colleges that are so new and that sort of explode after the Civil War. And one of the very first, of course, is going to be Vassar College and the Vassar Resolutes. And they sort of set the pattern for Smith and Wellesley and some of the others that are also going to form. And a lot of the early college teams, they played within their own college to begin with. So it might be, freshmen playing sophomores, juniors playing seniors, that kind of approach. And then gradually they started playing one another, particularly here in the Northeast area, where there were a lot of colleges available. And it generally took the support of some of the faculty in order to get the students to be able to play, and the administrators. And often the women's teams had some restrictions, which the men's teams didn't have. And I always find the two biggest restrictions kind of amusing and kind of interesting. One of them was that the teams were only allowed to play if nobody could see them. So if they were playing at the school, they had to play behind the school so people passing by wouldn't actually see girls out playing, which is rather interesting to think about. And then the second one was often, and this wasn't true universally, but they could continue to play as long as they didn't break anything. And everybody assumes that means legs and arms and things like that, but it also included at one of the schools where a girl hit a ball up and broke a window, and that put a stop to because they broke something. And so it was kind of interesting that there were some restrictions of that sort in order to get the ladies the opportunity to play, but there were certainly plenty of women's colleges, and most of them had a baseball team. Or two, or three.
And you know what else? I didn't see it in your book, and I'm sure your research, came across it because you also are what I consider an expert in the Negro Leagues. But the Dolly Vardens, it was not mentioned in your book. I don't know why.
No, because there's so much controversy about the Dolly Vardens, and the general story that has been told is actually been completely. We've discovered that the whole idea of them playing in the 1860s is actually not accurate, because unfortunately 19th century baseball research is very difficult, and it turns out that those early 1860s teams with the Dolly Varden name are actually male teams, and we don't see a female Dolly Varden team until the 1880s. And it's still rather unique, but it's not as early as people thought. And so that's partly why it's not there. It was an attempt to try to rectify and clarify what we thought we knew, and we now know that there were at least two Dolly Varden female teams, black teams, playing in the Philadelphia area in the 1880s. And we found articles to support that. The unfortunate thing, which is typical of women's baseball in particular, in any time period but the 19th century, is that they often got referred to as Miss Sally or Miss Sue with no last names, and so often hard to track down when you have no idea who these people are. And then, of course, with women, you also know that after their playing days were done, it was much more common than it is today, even for when women got married to change their names, and then you lose complete track of them that way as well. And so difficult to track down, but we now know that the Dolly Vardens were playing in Philadelphia, but not until the 1880s. So a little bit later than some people have said, but still fascinating. That they were playing in and around the Philadelphia area, playing one another, and then playing against other women's teams that were not black, and also playing occasionally against the men's team.
Now, you know what's interesting? Because, again, we're in Victorian times. Victoria's still queen till around 1901. So you have this aura of what a proper way a lady should be. Now, this I found very interesting. Well, this is what I found very interesting, Leslie. You know, it's amazing the kind of discrimination that they had against. Again, women couldn't vote, and they really were pretty much like, you know, I hate to say it, but I learned it in law school, like chattel. They were property to men, and men could do whatever they wanted because, you know.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, and it's disheartening. I usually don't like to talk about it. As a lawyer, I had to learn about it in law school. But this is what's strange. In the 1890s, when bicycles hit America, women were not allowed to ride a bicycle in the thing that their skirts might fly out. But from the bicycle craze, baseball thrived, and one of the most famous teams is, I love this name, Boston Bloomer girls. Let's talk about that.
Sure. Well, what's interesting in what you say is the 19th century is a fascinating one for looking at the role of women in anything, and unfortunately, female baseball players get caught up in this whole they didn't fit the proper image of women because of the idea that women were put up on a pedestal and this is the way you're supposed to behave. So the fact that you have female baseball players out there is rather unusual. And of course, the Boston Bloomer girls become one of the more well-known of the Bloomer Girl teams, which were prominent in the late 1890s and then all the way up through the 1920s and 1930s. And of course, their name comes from Amelia Bloomer, who created the Bloomers back in the 1840s. She first created them in 1848, and they didn't actually catch on, not surprisingly then, because they were a little too advanced for a lot of people to accept. And so they don't really catch on, interestingly, until the bicycle craze, because as you rightly point out, it's the bicycle that actually allows women to change their fashion, because the old skirts, that big heavy, you can't ride a bicycle. You'd kill yourself doing that. And so that's what really changed and allowed and really brought the bloomers into sort of acceptable fashion. And once you did that, that's how you get the names of the baseball teams, and it changes the nature of how women are going to be able to play, because at that point you now got women who have been able to give up the skirts, which means they can run, they can participate, the game looks more like what people are expecting, so it's no longer quite the novelty and curiosity that it was before, and that's what allows a team like the Bloomer Girls to really take off. And by the time you hit the 19 teens, they're playing all across the New England area. They are traveling to other places, and so it becomes a fascinating thing to see.
And, you know, one of the standouts on the Bloomers was the pitcher Maud Nelson. And not only was she a fantastic pitcher, but she also went on to be an owner. Let's talk about Maud Nelson for a second.
Sure. Maud Nelson is one of the most underrated and unknown, sadly, players who not only was a fantastic player herself, but loved the game so much and had such a understanding of the game that not only did she work with the Boston Bloomers, the New York Bloomers, she had her own teams. She went on to not only just be a part of that team, she was a third baseman for a good part of her early career, but they estimate that Nelson was probably involved in women's baseball from the 1880s all the way into the 1940s. And if you think about that, that's a 40-year career. She pitched, she played third base, she scouted, she owned, and she managed. So she did pretty much everything you can think of during the course of her career. And she was with the Boston Bloomer Girls in the late 1890s, and at one point when she was their starting pitcher, they won an estimated 28 straight games in 26
Wow.
days. And that's pretty amazing to think about. And so, she and her husband, John, were the owners of the Western Bloomer Girls. And when her husband died, in 1917, she continued to run the team. And then they took over another team in the 1920s, and she managed a team called the All-Star Rangers until the mid-1930s. And was the owner of that team as well. And she was, not afraid to go after players anywhere she could find them, in order to create the best teams possible.
And let me ask you this. How did, women baseball, which was pretty much considered a novelty, in the time of Maud Nelson, change by the 1920s?
Well, by the time you hit the 1920s, what you have is, interestingly, I think, a reflection of the changes overall in society, because when you go from the 1880s and 1890s, you're talking about women's teams that were playing in skirts, still playing by some of the old rules, rarely had gloves, you could still catch the ball on one bounce, so that was the kind of play, and to some degree, some people have argued, think about it, I always find this fascinating, catching the ball on one bounce when you have a big old skirt is actually an advantage, because you can wrap it up in the skirt and it's not going anywhere. So by the time you hit by the time you hit the 1920s, you've got a changing attitude towards women, because the 1920s, of course, is the era of the flapper and all of those. The fashion has changed, and so women are able to actually look like ball players, play more like one would expect a ball player to play. So the game becomes, by the 1920s, looks with overhand pitching as opposed to the underhand pitching, which was much more common earlier. And so in that respect, you've got it looking like the men's game. They're playing on the same fields. They're playing less and less with men on their team, because in the 1880s and 1890s, a very common thing for a traveling women's baseball team was to have at least two male players on the team, usually the pitcher and the catcher, because the assumption was, women couldn't handle those two positions, and so you'd put them. But by the 19 teens and 1920s, that's not true anymore, and the teams are primarily women, including their pitchers and catchers, owners, and that's also the other big change. 1880s and 1890s. Most of the owners, most of the managers were all men. Some of them rather unscrupulous men who took advantage of this opportunity. But by the 1920s, that has begun to change as well. And so the enterprise itself looks very different from top to bottom.
And what goes on here is that by the 1920s, we're seeing that women were considered talented enough to play for all male teams, and you saw that in both the amateur and semi-pro levels. And I think our discussion should start here, and it's dear to me because I'm a stone throw away from Rhode Island. Rhode Island's Lizzie Murphy.
Mm-hmm. Yep. She is a perfect example of what was happening, which was this opportunity to give a few of the women who are out there a chance. She was referred to as the Queen of Baseball. She started playing really at about age of 17 or 18, played for an American League All-Star team, played for a National League All-Star team, got a chance to play at least one game against the Boston Red Sox in a exhibition game, and was in one against the Boston Braves. Played from about the 1920 to mid 1930s. And instead of being a pitcher, she was actually a first baseman for much of her career. She claims, and seems to be some good evidence, that she got a hit off Satchel Paige. In at least one report about her career, we don't necessarily have the full backup for this, but even just to think about it is that she hit almost 300 during her 15-year career. And that's pretty impressive to think about, because that happened on male teams. And so she also was an ice hockey player in addition to playing baseball, which... Yeah, most people don't realize that, because she came from a French-Canadian family, and so she played hockey as well. for a little bit of time. And so she's quite an impressive person. The unfortunate thing is she is also typical of others who came along who got a chance. Lizzie Arlington, Lizzie Murphy, a number of others. They were seen rather than as examples of what women could do, they became the exception. And it was still, these are just what a few women can do, not what women should be able to be able to do. And that is the unfortunate part of the story.
And similarly, like in the Negro Leagues, you had factory teams, because women worked in the factories, just, like men. And they had factory teams. One of them, I think, was the Philadelphia Bobbies, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, the Philadelphia Bobbies did kind of get their start that way, and then they became a typical, essentially barnstorming semi-professional team. And the Philadelphia Bobbies, I think, are one of the most fascinating stories of early women's baseball because they were from everything we know, such an incredible team. And they had two incredible players on their team, and the most famous, of course, is Edith Houghton, and she was a teenager on the Philadelphia Bobbies, who also played on a number of men's teams, considered to be the best player on the team. And the team, with their owner, a former Major League ball player, he got them a trip to Japan in 1925, which is kind of amazing to think about. And so he took them to Japan in 1925 to play a series of games there. They were incredibly well received when they arrived in Japan. They are going to go over there. Maud Nelson had once been on the team. She's not going to take part in that particular trip, but they go over to Japan. They play to very large crowds, get a lot of support. Unfortunately for them, this was also typical of the time period. Their manager decided to leave them there. Thankfully, the people of Japan felt sorry for them, took up a collection, got them the money to return to the United States, which they were able to do. And they, unfortunately, on the return to the United States, they had ran into a terrible storm, and one of the players got washed overboard.
Oh my gosh!
It was a very sad ending to that particular story. But the team itself played from Tokyo and Osaka, Yokohama, and of course, interestingly, a lot of people don't realize at the time that Japan had women's baseball, and so it was not an unusual sight for the Japanese to see female ball players.
Why the heck did they leave them there in Japan, of all places?
Well, the owner, unfortunately, was typical of a lot. This was not an unusual thing to happen. He had made money. He didn't want to have to pay the players, and so he just decided to take off with what money he had made and leave them there. And that's basically what he did. But thankfully, the Japanese people took up the local communities took up collections so they could pay for the passage for the women to come back home, and they did.
I just learned something brand new here. See, you never know what you're going to learn on my show. Even I don't know. That was just, this is why I love doing this show. It's stuff like this which is priceless. We move now to the Depression, and you would think that the Depression would affect moving forward for the women, but it actually didn't, as I understand. Women baseball players toured internationally. They played junior ball, and they also signed major league contracts. Minor league contracts.
Minor league contracts. We do have a couple in the 1930s. I would say actually that women's baseball does hit a little bit of a hiccup in the 1930s because of the Depression. It doesn't disappear though, which is but certainly it has its same difficulties a lot of other things do. Maybe a little more complicated because of the idea that, men were the breadwinners, women were not supposed to be, and so in a time period of economic difficulty, You don't want women earning money that could go to men. But at the same time, what you do have are a few exceptions to that. The Bloomer Girl teams are going to continue. Maud Nelson's team continues. There's a number of them that do. And then there are a few women who are going to get a chance to sign contracts, mostly for exhibition kinds of opportunities to try to raise money for teams, as again, that whole idea that they were a curiosity rather than something more important than that. And so that's the kind of thing that you're going to see in the 1930s, typical of other teams that, would sometimes bring in shows during the innings in between to entertain people, that kind of thing. And so the one big exception to that, the one story that most everybody thinks about, of course, is Jackie Mitchell. Jackie Mitchell signed a contract with a team out of Tennessee in 1931. And obviously, this is a story that has been told a lot. The exhibition game where she pitched against Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and struck them both out. Even though Babe Ruth kind of said later, he claimed that, of course, it was a joke and it was an exhibition, and she didn't really strike him out. And Lou Gehrig, of course, said, yes, they did. Yes, she did. And so depending on how you choose to believe that story, it was reported that she did strike them both out.
And I was going to get to that next, but you beat me to it. So, well, yeah, because, you're talking about my New York Yankees, and that is a story. That is a familiar story that, has been around for the last 80 years. Now we're getting into World War II, probably the most important time for women's baseball. You got Joe DiMaggio, you got Ted Williams, you got all these players going to either Europe or Asia to fight the Second World War. Thank God Franklin Delano Roosevelt saved baseball, saying let it continue. But then you have Philip Wrigley, who, again, I believe was the son of the original owner of the Cubs, and Wrigley's chewing gum, and he decides, why don't we have an baseball league? Gets tired.
Yep, he did. Wrigley, an interesting guy, decided that here was an opportunity, he thought, to make some money and to also keep baseball going, because during the war, even though Roosevelt saved the game in terms of allowing travel and things like that, we still had over 500 ball players who were going to get drafted in from the minor leagues and the major leagues. So the fear was, of course, that even with Roosevelt's support, baseball was going to go away. And so Wrigley thought this was a great opportunity to take advantage of that and provide women's game so that people could be entertained and have something to look forward to and to raise money for the war, things of that sort. And so in 1943, he decides that he wants to start a women's league here in the Midwest area, and that's where all the teams will ultimately be. It stays in the Midwest. But his idea was this was supposed to be a league, in his view at least, that was going to be very temporary. It would last for a year or two. He thought the duration, depending on how long the war at that point was going to go on, he never intended it to last as long as it did. It's going to last till 1954. When he started it with the idea that it would be more like softball, and he didn't necessarily intend it to be and have it look exactly like baseball, and it didn't when it started, and it will the rules will change over the years. He actually owned the league for only 1 year. Again, that sort of temporary idea that he had, he thought when the need was gone, the league would go away. And it doesn't, because he sells it off to one of his that men that worked for him, Art Meyerhoff, and Art Meyerhoff will take over the league for a number of years. And then for the final years of the league, the women themselves are going to run it. And so that's how it lasts until 1954, way longer than anybody expected. The other thing about Wrigley's involvement with the league, and this has a lasting effect on it, was he was the one who also made the decision that it was important for people to remember that these were ladies first, ball players second. And so that's how you come up with the unfortunate uniforms that do not suit themselves to playing baseball or softball, the skirts that they wore. But that was his way of making sure that people remembered that these were ladies first, ball players second. He thought that that was important for a whole variety of reasons. I think it's also part of the reason the league was both a curiosity and so acceptable to some people that it was women first, and they were intrigued by this idea that women would get out there on the ball field and play. And so that was his intent when he started the league.
Well, this is, I want to get into a little bit more about Wrigley because in your book it mentions that Wrigley felt that sex appeal would help sell his women's, but at the same time, and this is what we're really going to discuss, because we will select the kind of players that people will want to see in action. Then we will groom them and make sure they're acceptable. It won't be like the bad old days of peep shows and bloomer girls. What's he referring to when he says that? Well,
what he was referring to was the whole idea of what attitude people had towards the bloomer girls in the 1880s and 1890s, which was, as you alluded to earlier, these were not proper good women because no family would let their daughters go travel around and play baseball. Baseball was not a sport for women. Baseball was associated with gambling and drinking and all of those kind of things. So what kind of woman was, in his view, would have possibly played? Well, not somebody that, not the girl you take home to meet mom and dad kind of an approach. And so he wanted to make sure that people understood this was going to be different. He was going to be a different kind of owner. They would not be taken advantage of. There would not be, there were terrible stories during the 1880s and 1890s of Sylvester Wilson, who was one of the owners, who exploited his teams on multiple occasions, had to run away to escape being thrown in jail for embezzling funds and all kinds of things. So that was part of it. And then he mentions the peak shows and all of that. That was a reference to, of course, the carnival days, where the freak shows and all those kinds of things were what people were entertained by. And so you go to the carnival to see the largest man or the largest woman in the world and the two-headed, those kinds of things. And he wanted to say that this is not going to be like that. This is serious. You can bring your families. But he also acknowledged, which is what's kind of ironic, that he wanted to make sure that these are the right women playing so that they present the right image. And that was they had to look good. They had to know how to talk to the press. They had to understand what was expected of them. They had to dress appropriately. He's the one that starts the charm school, which only lasts for a year during his reign, to make sure they understood how to look, how to talk, how to represent the way he wanted them to represent his interest, the game of baseball, and get people to come out and see them. And he thought, well, if you get the right women, it'll not only appeal in the general sense that these are women who are very feminine, they're not losing that, but it'll also attract a male audience who will want to come and see them play. And so he was not above both of those sort of attitudes at the same time.
No, that is so interesting. Now, of course, the standout player, which we have to talk about, is Dottie Welts, who pitched. She even pitched when she was 6 months pregnant, for God's sakes.
Yes, she did. It was Dottie Wiltse Collins, an incredible ball player, one of the certainly credited by many as being her primary claim to fame is her strikeouts. That was what she's known as. She played for 6 years with the Millerettes and the Fort Wayne Daisies. According to league records, she pitched in over 200 games. I think it was 220 some odd. I can't remember the exact number. Over 1,200 strikeouts by the time she was done. One of the few standout pitchers with a solid winning record. She won over nearly 120 games in her career. And so that was pretty impressive. And so she certainly is one of the standouts, made the All-Star, the league had an All-Star game every year, and she was certainly one of those. She started playing in the second year of the league in 1944, and came out of California, where so many of the players did, former softball player. So she had to make the adjustment from a softball pitcher to hand pitcher, which the league kind of worked its way into that. They went from underhand to sidearm to then overhand pitching. And so she was one of those pitchers who was able to make that transition successfully.
And besides, this is another great character of the All-American Girls Baseball League, Sophie Curtis. Now, this is an amazing story because just stealing one base in a skirt just gives me oh my God, my leg is going to be so ripped up it's not even going to be funny. Let's talk about Sophie.
Sophie Curtis, opposite of Dottie Wiltsey, because Sophie Curtis, of course, was a second baseman. She's an infielder, and played a number of years, again, with Battle Creek for the most part, and Racine. One of the things that was true about the All-American League that most people don't realize is the players at the end of every season, the teams got together and they redistributed the players every year to make sure that there was no team really got like the Yankees, or you could win for 10 years in a row, because they thought that would destroy attendance. So Curtis plays for a couple of teams, but her claim to fame, of course, is she could steal bases like nobody's business. In her fourth season, 46, she played in just over 110 games, and she stole over 200 bases. I mean, that's just incredible to think about. And that was not like an aberration. In another season, she stole over 160. In another one, she stole over 170. All usually playing just over 110 games. And so, and hitting in the mid 200s, 240 to 270 most of the time. But she was fast. She was incredibly fast. Was Player of the Year in the season that she hit, where she stole just over 200 bases. She also scored almost 120 runs. She walked nearly 100 times in that particular season, which helped. So you put her hits together. So she had almost 120 hits, almost 100 walks. So she's on base over 200 times, and she steals over 200 bases.
That's
tells you that she was successful almost every single time.
200
and of course, as you can imagine, and so think about that. But as you can imagine, that unfortunately got her some criticism as well, because some people tried to simply say that the only reason she stole those many bases is because women catchers didn't have strong arms and couldn't throw her out, which was not an accurate statement, because at the same time, then you'd have to say, well, the bases, are farther apart than women are used to running, and you've claimed up to this point that women aren't fast enough. You can't have it both ways. You can't say, well, okay, they're not fast enough, but, now that she's stealing bases, it's because the catcher can't throw her out. But that's what people said. So you get these very interesting commentaries on what's happening as well.
And it's when you think about it, Ricky Henderson still holds the record of only 130 bases compared to Sophie, who had 201. And in a game that really doesn't showcase much stealing anymore. I think the days of stealing in Major League Baseball is past. I think the 80s were the heyday of it. Such a record that probably never will be broken. But you know what I liked about this whole World War II and the popularity of the Women's League is that some of these teams started to cultivate, junior leagues, and one of them was the Racine Bells. Let's discuss, the Junior Bells and their impact on especially other teams trying to foster and cultivate.
That's one of the neat things about the league over the course of its existence. A number of teams, Racine being one of them, but they were not alone. The Springfield Sallies came along as another. The idea was that they wanted to essentially create almost like their own minor league system, where they were being able to teach younger girls the game. Usually the junior teams were girls. Generally, when they started, and the Racine Bells, Junior Bells are the best example, 14 and under was the general idea for them. Not all of the junior teams ended up following that rule as time passed. Some of them went on to really treat the teams. And I think the Springfield Sallies were probably the best example, where some of the players were older, but they used it almost like, well, you haven't played baseball before, so let's go give you a chance to learn the game. And then when you have the skills necessary, we'll bring you onto the big team, so to speak, and we'll give you that chance. The Chicago Colleens were the other team that were like that. And they were added in 1948 in an effort to try to sort of provide, because so many of the girls were softball players and had never played baseball, and the fact that the rules are so different and the bases and all of those, that was the idea. But it also meant you're reaching out farther into the community, you are expanding your fan base, you're expanding all of those things, and that was the other important side of it, was an attempt to try to expand people's interest, to show people and to showcase and to reach out into some of these communities that didn't necessarily have players and show them that this was an opportunity for women, and that's probably the best part of what they did.
And like we mentioned, the league went from 1943 to 1954. And then around 1955, Bill Arlington formed two women's teams called the Arlington's All-Stars. They barnstormed the U.S., playing in men's town and semi-pro teams. What was that about?
Yes,
we don't hear much about that.
No, we don't, because everybody thinks when the league went out, it just immediately closed its doors, and that was the end of it. And of course, Bill Arlington, who had brought so many of the players out of California, decided that this was an opportunity to continue on a barnstorming level, and part of that was the idea of the curiosity, part of it, and certainly most of it was he saw an opportunity to make money. And so he decided that he was going to continue, and there were two teams, and they traveled often together, and then sometimes played just one another, and sometimes they played men's teams. They traveled all over, lasted for 2 years, and 2 years primarily with the two teams, and then one of the teams lasted all the way till 1958. And they barnstormed throughout the United States and Canada. They went one of the years down into Mexico and played, and it was all former players from the All-American League, plus a few ladies, and most people don't know this, who came out of the Chicago Women's Baseball League, which was actually not a baseball league, even though they called it that. It was a softball league that was operating at the same time as the All-American League. And a lot of the players kind of went back and forth between the two. And so he pulled some players from there as well. And they played about, we think, somewhere in the range of 30 to maybe 40 games over the course of each of those years against primarily men's teams. And so it kept it alive. But we don't hear much about it, I don't think, because the primary reason the league folded, the arrival of television and the opportunity for people to watch Major League Baseball, and you didn't have to watch these kinds. I mean, it hurt minor league baseball just in general as well. And so I think that's primarily the reason we didn't hear much about it, and people just assumed 1950s is also, the whole, let's go back to the way things were before. And so the idea that, the league is folded, the women are going to go back home, and so people stopped paying attention.
And you know what's interesting, Leslie? We celebrate the 25th anniversary now of the League of Their Own, made by
this year.
One of my favorite directors, good old Laverne, Penny Marshall, from Laverne and Shirley. How accurate do you think the movie was in how the league really did run?
My students are always amazed when I say, because I don't say this very often about most historical movies, it's actually fairly accurate. They do a really good job of capturing the essence of the league. They get a lot of the basic ideas of the league correct. They certainly changed the name of Philip Wrigley in the movie, but the idea and the concept is still there, so it's not the biggest complaint that a lot of the ladies have about the movie, which is an accurate one, is the way some of the characters are overdone in the Hollywood fashion, and particularly the character that Tom Hanks plays, because their claim, of course, is that that kind of a manager with the drinking problem he had and things like that just didn't happen. And so from their standpoint, that's one of the biggest complaints. They also object to the fact that the character he was supposed to be playing, representing one of the managers at the time, was no longer alive by the time the movie came out, and so didn't have a chance to, say anything, and it seemed to them like an unfortunate way to do that. But overall, in terms of the general gist of the league, who they played, where they played, the level of play, how they were treated, those kinds of things, it does a pretty good job. And I think it's well worth watching, and without that movie, people would have no idea. Probably still. I mean, that's when you talk about women's baseball, that's usually the only reference most people have, is that league, and they're amazed to discover there was any other opportunities for women to play baseball except that.
That's why we have shows like this to tell people there's a lot of learning to do. But there's a lot of learning. I learned a lot of new things today already. We're not even done with the show. But let me just say this. Hey, let me just throw this caveat in. Bob Hope, he started women baseball teams twice, once in the 80s and once in the 90s. I never knew that before.
Yes. His 80s efforts were short-lived, but he learned a little bit of a lesson, I think. And it's Bob Hope, not the Bob Hope that people think it is. It was Bob Hope from Coors, the Coors Brewing Company. And his biggest effort comes in the 1990s when he forms the Colorado Silver Bullets, who lasted for 4 years, and most people have no idea. They traveled all over the country, and they were playing men's teams of all different varieties, and gave almost 200 young ladies a chance to play baseball. And their first 3 years, they struggled, but by their fourth year, they actually had a winning season against a variety of opponents. And then Coors pulled the plug because they said that it was costing them too much money, which was very unfortunate because they were really just starting to take off. They had some incredible players, college softball players, those kinds of things primarily. I got to see them play twice, actually. Out in Kansas City at Kauffman Stadium, because that was often an opportunity where they got to play a men's team before the major league teams came into the stadium to play. And so I saw them play two semi-pro teams out in Kansas City. And what was interesting to me with those two games was to watch the audience, because the games were before the Royals played. And it was interesting to look around the stands and see all these moms with their daughters, Girl Scout troops, all kinds of things come in for the game. Sadly, as soon as the game was over, they would leave, and then, and I'll put this in sort of quotes, the regular audience would come in to watch the Royals play. And that was the only, I thought, downside, that none of these other people got to see, and they weren't interested in seeing. But I think they also didn't know. Publicity was tough. And it's still the issue. So the Colorado Silver Bullets, those kinds of teams in more recent years have not gotten any more publicity than the earlier teams. And that's always why it's hard to get the word out. But Bob Hope certainly gave so many women an opportunity in the 1990s.
And now I want to turn to another thing that's dear to my heart, because I'm friends with good old umpire Terry Bob, and she's been doing it now for 38 years. But let's talk about the umpires. We'll get to Perry in a little bit. She's been on the show about 4 or 5 times, but I'll probably have her back again. But let me ask you this: let's talk about Amanda Clements, because this is a very important thing. You've written a huge article in Sabre. Not a lot of people know about her.
No, Amanda Clements is our first female umpire who got an opportunity to play, and who was umpire, got paid starting in 1905, 6, and 7. She got a chance to umpire because her brother was a ball player, and she used to go to games with him, and at one of his games, the umpire didn't show up. And so at the age of 16, she gets asked to umpire because her brother said she knows the rules better than anybody, and it turned out she did. She worked about 55 games a year during the summertime, and she used the money she made at those games to pay her way through college. 4 years of school. She umpired for 6 years, and she umpired all around the far Midwest, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, that area, and was very well respected. Very well received for the most part because she proved that she knew what she was talking about. And I think she was 5'10" about, and so I think that probably helped in terms of she was a commanding presence, but she does not, and she herself admitted, in her own talking about her games, that occasionally she'd run into fans or another manager that tried to take advantage of the fact, but she really didn't have too much trouble, and she enjoyed it, and most importantly, it paid her way through school. And so from 1904 through 1910, she was umpiring, or 1909, she was umpiring throughout the far Midwest, and that incredibly unusual because we're not going to see another female umpire of getting paid, at that level until the 1970s.
That's right. And but you know what? We could have a whole show on umpires. I did not see in your book, and it's probably going to be in your next book, we had Lorraine Heinisch of Kenosha, Wisconsin. We had Bernice Guerra, I think her name is. We have a few women that are umping, and people made fun of them. They call them the wumps, women umpires, and that's another talk for another time. But now we're getting to the 1970s, and we're getting to the point where we're going to be closed in. And I remember this. I remember the Sports Illustrated cover of Pam Postema.
Yes. Yep. She was the first to umpire a Major League Baseball spring training game. She had applied to go to umpiring school, the Wendelstadt School down in Florida in the late 1970s. Finally admitted her. She got a job in 1977, spent 2 years at the rookie Gulf Coast League before she got her opportunity at single A and double A, and then got promoted all the way up to triple A, and spent 6 years at the triple A level. People thought that she was going to get a chance. She never got that opportunity. And then she got an opportunity to umpire Major League Spring Training in 1988, and then the Hall of Fame game between the Yankees and the Atlanta Braves, but the commissioner at the time was Bart Giamatti, and everybody thought he was going to give her a chance. He unfortunately died very unexpectedly in 89, and that was the last chance. She spent 13 years in the minors, and her contract was canceled after the 1989 season, and that was the end of her career. Done, and the best chance we've seen for anybody up until recently to get that opportunity. And I think we don't know what would have happened if Giamatti had stayed as commissioner, but it certainly looked positive at that time. And we won't see another female umpire getting a chance to do a Major League Spring Training game, that kind of thing, until 2007 with Rhea Cortesia. And she's the next one who goes all the way up to the AAA level and never makes it beyond there either. And so Pam Postema and Rhea Cortesia, whose careers are almost exactly 30 years apart, are the two that get that opportunity.
Now, I'm one for controversy because I'm a controversial guy. I don't ask easy questions. But I'm going to tell you, and you already know, Pam sued the Major League Baseball for sex discrimination. And in my studies on both Cortesia and Postema, I guarantee it, there was sex discrimination. We don't know. She wrote a book, Pam. We don't. I mean,
you gotta have balls.
Yeah, you got to get. We know that Major League Baseball settled with her, and
absolutely.
She was never supposed to talk about what was settled about, and she was never to apply for another umpire's post again. So they blackballed her that way. But Maria Cortesia, which again, you're talking 17 years later, falls into the same trap. They bring, Major League Baseball brings these umpires up. They're right at the cusp, and then they don't
Right.
follow through. They don't follow
Yeah.
through, which other sports.
Cortesio was there for 9 years, and
Yep.
and then was essentially released after her 9 years, and Postuma was there for 13, and Postuma had settled, and Cortesia she thought that she was going to have a shot at moving up from the AA to the AAA, and she did not. And Cortesia even acknowledges that at one point she worked really hard, and this is a sad thing to think about, to lower her voice, to make it sound more, trying to make herself sound more manly out there on the field. She had really long hair, and at one point she cut it to make it look so that she could try to see if that would help her fit in better. And it did not work any better than it did for Pam Postuma. And Cortesia just simply decided to move on with her family's winery business when it was all done. She did not file the same way that Pam did, but you can guarantee that they had similar concerns and similar issues.
And this is what I want to say, because I know what it's like to be discriminated, not only as a Jew, but also when I converted to Catholicism. Now I was discriminated by my own people. The Jews.
Oh,
but
yeah.
I wrote an article 2 years ago, and if you Google my name, I'm not going to give the publication because I'm not going to rat anyone out. But if you Google my name, Ian Kahanowitz, the lady is an ump. They published my first 2 articles on women umpires, and I interviewed Perry for one. I interviewed I forgot her name. It's in there, but it's not coming to my head. She's going to kill me when she hears the thing. But the third one, I argued with the editor because I make a strong case against Major League Baseball that they are so far back in the Stone Ages by not letting women and cultivating women to come in, that I got fired from my job doing that because it was such a radical piece using evidence I got from Cuba and in China. Of course, you got Ava Mu, who also umpired with Perry when Perry went over to Guam, and I posted Perry in Guam today.
I saw that, yep.
Yeah, it's amazing. I did that because, we're going to talk about women in baseball today. But the thing is, in your opinion, and again, this is only opinion, do you think, do you think that Major League Baseball and Bob Neppa is a great example, Houston National pitcher. Pam, he had everything in the world to say about Pam, when it's a woman umpire, what's going on. Do you think that women umpires are getting the same respect, or do you think there's still discrimination going on?
Oh, I still think that it's a tough road for a woman umpire to make it through because the game is still, it's no different in the sense that the game is still very much seen as a traditional male venue, and so it's the players have a hard time being taken seriously, and the female umpires have the same. And it's kind of ironic because football now has sideline umps, basketball has done it, and baseball has not. And so once again, baseball is behind the curve, and it's not just baseball itself. I would argue it's the fans as well who give the umpires and look at female umpires as some kind of anomaly instead of, it's like, excuse me, it's all about knowing the rules and understanding the game, and there's nothing to say that women cannot do that just as well as any man can. And so the idea that they'll throw up the notion, well, we have to have separate locker rooms for them, blah, 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 and that's difficult. That's just ridiculous, in my humble opinion. That's simply an ongoing excuse. And Major League Baseball at some point has to recognize that and move forward. And, with the 2 young ladies that are currently going to be umpiring this year at the low level, Jan Pawal, was one of those 2. That's a positive sign that we had 2 that graduated. But think about that. So we have 2 out of the 130 or so that attend the umpiring school. Part of the problem is there's a monopoly on the umpiring school. There's only 2 that are accepted, and so it's very, very difficult to get in and pass your way through that. And granted, minimal spots for anybody, but it should be the best and most qualified individuals, regardless of who they are. Now, when Cuba and Taiwan and other places, Canada is so far ahead of us in female umpires and has been for a long time. Lisa Baker has been in charge of their female umpiring school forever up there, it seems like, and they do very, very well in promoting that idea. And, you know, we don't. Though Perry herself has just been put in charge for this fall with a league that's going to have entire female umpiring crew for the first time ever, an independent league, and that's a huge step forward. But you know, it's all I can say is it's about time.
Well, even before we get into Perry Barber, because you just mentioned that she's being put in front of the independent team, I want to compare and contrast this to Negro leagues. Effa Manley was so adamant to get Negro League teams, not players per se, into Major League Baseball. But it backfired in the sense that whole teams were not picked up by Major League Baseball. Only star players were. Because of that, and also because of the advent of TV like we spoke about, the leagues folded. Do you see women having their own league, like a WNBA, you know, which is pretty much run by the NBA, and we'll have a, you know, WMLB, or do you see integration with female players and female umpires in Major League Baseball?
Well, you know, it's kind of an interesting thing to think about. And I think if you talk to most female ball players, and I tend to think that this is what they want is their own league. They don't necessarily all think that the idea is that they want to be integrated into the men's league, recognizing that many of them would not have necessarily the skill sets. So from the playing standpoint, many of them simply want the opportunity to play, which means their own league, like the WNBA, which would take Major League Baseball support to sponsor that kind of thing, which would give hundreds and hundreds of women a chance to play. Now, on the other side, with the umpires, there is no reason to say that umpires should not have that opportunity to umpire at the Major League level, and at the same time also to say that if there's a women ball players out there who are good enough to play Major League, they should get that opportunity. But for the vast majority of them, what they really want is their own leagues and their own opportunity to play against other women, and to see that as the highest, on the same level as what you see Major League Baseball. That was the problem for the Negro Leagues. You know, the Negro Leagues had never been recognized at the same level of play as the Major Leagues, so when the players were thinking about it, what they wanted was the chance to play at the highest level, to be recognized that what they were doing, that highest level happened to be Major League Baseball. So that's where they went. And, of course, that brought about the demise of the Negro Leagues and pushed all of that out. And so it's not an easy thing to think about, but what really most female ball players want is the chance to play against other women in their own league.
And, you know, let's mention Perry Bobby. I'm not going to go into her whole career, but she has been around for 38 years. She came up at a time, her and her twin sister, Warren, when, you know, it just wasn't fashionable to be an umpire if you're a woman. She was a singer-songwriter. She opened for Billy Joel and Bruce Springsteen. I've seen videos of her in the 1970s. How important, and she never made it to the minor leagues. And she's going to be, you know, she's going to be 64 years old. She's going to love when she hears this. She's going to kill me. 64, mate.
You're getting yourself in all kinds of trouble, Ian.
I tell Perry I'm like in love with you, you know, and she thinks I'm nuts. I said, you're one of my heroes. And she's one of my heroes because of her perseverance and what she's done.
Oh, yeah.
For women.
She has worked incredibly hard to get recognition for and opportunities for female umpires. She never lets an opportunity go by to push, and she's not pushing for herself. She's pushing for women in general, and I think that's the most amazing thing. And so this opportunity this fall for them in the Desert League to get this chance, and Perry in charge of it, and an all-female umpiring crew, I just think is going to be incredible, and I just hope that it gets the publicity that it deserves. And not as a, and here's the dilemma, not as a novelty, but just for the fact that they're out there and they can do the job like anybody else. Because when we continue to see it as a novelty and an exception, it's never going to get accepted. And we have to get past seeing these as just this one-time novelty. What'll happen now? And until we can do that, nothing's going to change. And so we have to be able to see beyond just seeing it as an, ooh, this is a great thing because it's never happened before. Yes, it is. But it's more than that. And it needs to become more acceptable and say, no, this is just great because these are umpires who know what they are doing and they do a good job, and everybody should get that same chance.
I want to talk about two executives, and then we'll have a short discussion of the. I know it's running over, but that's. I don't know. Do you have anywhere to be, or am I holding you up too much time?
I do in about 5 to 10 minutes because I'm actually not at home. So.
Oh, okay. I'll tell you what. We'll do executives another time. Let's talk about the International Women's Baseball Center. How important is this for women?
I think it's an incredible opportunity to try to bring together all of the different groups that work with women's baseball and get us all connected and get everybody cooperating and working together to try to promote current opportunities, future opportunities, and to also recognize and celebrate the past history of women in baseball, because you've got to have all three of those things. And so the goal of the International Women's Baseball Center is to really bring all three of those components together to show that women have a past in baseball, they have a present, and they have a future. And to provide a center, because we're trying to build a museum in Rockford right across the street from Byers Stadium where the Peaches played, will provide that place. And place is important, a place where a repository for materials, an opportunity for education, clinics, tournaments, all of those kinds of things, all being promoted from one central place, which I think would be fantastic for helping to bring publicity to the game.
And let me ask you this, Leslie. Did I forget anything or anything you wanted to mention before we end the show here?
I guess sort of along those same lines, just one final thing that I would say, we're talking about people who have made an incredible impact, and I think it would be important to just mention Justine Siegel and Baseball for All, and all of the incredible, when we talk about Perry Barber's career, Justine Siegel on the player's side, on the coaching side, on the managing side, has done all of those things. Some people recognize Justine's name because she's the first woman to pitch batting practice for a major league team, but she's also the first woman to manage and coach, and she last year coached the Israeli team, all kinds of things that she continues to do. And the tournament this summer, the Women's National is going to be held in Rockford, and that's the doing of Justine Siegel and her organization Baseball for All, which continues to promote this idea that girls just need the chance to play, and they should have the same opportunity, hence the name of the group, Baseball for All. And Baseball for All and the IWBC are working together to promote the Nationals this summer in Rockford in July, at the end of July.
That's fantastic. I'm mentioning Justine Siegel. I was going to, but we're running short. Where can we find your book?
That's why you asked me, and I thought that would be a good way to end, is to mention her as well, as somebody that people aren't aware of her. They could Google her and look up what she's done, and they'd learn a lot.
I learned a lot in this show, more than I did my homework, and I still learned a lot. It was, as always, it's a pleasure to have you on the show, Leslie. Let me ask
I appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun.
It's always fun with you. I learn new stuff every day, and all my listeners at home, this is just like the Negro Leagues. It's got to get out there because it's important. Where can we find your book, Encyclopedia of Women in Baseball, and when's part 2 coming out?
The easiest place to find it right now is on Amazon. It's published by McFarlane, but you can get it off Amazon. It's now in its paperback, so it's a little cheaper than it was previously. We're hoping to see the second one come out probably sometime late next year. I think is probably the expectation at this point.
You got to send me a copy. You'll be back on the
Of
show
course.
in another month to talk about the ending of the Negro Leagues and star players. Hold the line. I'm going to end the show. As soon as we end the show, I'll just have a quick chat, folks. I hope you enjoyed this very important segment of Genesis. As you see, there's more to women's baseball than the 1940s. Go out, get the Encyclopedia of Women in Baseball, do some research. It's a very important part of baseball, not only in American history, but world history. As always, I'm Ian Kahanowitz. I'm in for Marc Weiss, who's on assignment, and for Leslie Hefty, and the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow. Good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.